Good Yontif. After World War I, Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, the rabbinical leader in Jerusalem, met with the League of Nations. Europe and Middle East were in total disarray. The diplomats asked him if Eretz Yisrael could absorb large-scale Jewish immigration. At the end of the Great War, Tel Aviv looked like a 19th century Western town, not unlike Tombstone. Most of Israel lacked industry and housing. The land wasn't cultivated, and the Defense Forces was just in its infancy stages. Rabbi Sonnenfeld answered, "Have you ever heard of a mother say that she has no place for her children? Eretz Yisrael, our mother, will always find a place for her children." It's been nearly 100 years since Rabbi Sonnenfeld addressed the diplomats. And in those 100 years, we have suffered. We were murdered by the Cossacks, slaughtered by the Polish in Pinsk, and attacked by the Russians. We were massacred by the Nazis in Baba Yar and sent to the infernos and to the gas chambers. We were sheep sent to the slaughterhouses. Whether it's been 100 years or 100 past generations, victimhood was a defining feature of our exile and experience. But we never gave up Torah. We never gave up our hope for a better future. We prayed for strength, justice, and peace, and above all, the return to our promised land so that we could be masters of our fate. Rabbi Sonnenfeld believed it, and though mocked and rebuked and challenged by so many Jews of his generation, Theodor Herzl, the father of modern Zionism, said, "A wondrous breed of Jews will spring up from the earth. The Maccabees will rise again. The Jews who will it shall achieve their own state. We shall live at last as free men and women on our own soil and our own home die peacefully." And after 2,500 years of exile and oppression, we defied the unthinkable and created Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, in 1948. In just 73 years of modern existence, Israel ranks among the world's top countries in innovation, healthcare, business startups, military prowess, education, and something even untangible like happiness, despite surrounded by enemies. And Tel Aviv, the once desolate hill, is now the economic and technological center in the entire Middle East. The Talmud teaches us, whoever sees a place where miracles happen to the Jewish people must say, "Blessed be he who worked wonders for our ancestors in this place." The state of Israel is the greatest miracle for the Jewish people. It's in this land where her citizens are writing the new story of the Jewish people, that after 2,500 years of exile, servitude, ghettos, and death camps, we are here to stay. We are not going anywhere. We will defend our people. And above all, we are not victims anymore. For many of us, our love for Israel won't ever diminish. We visited Israel many times, seeing this miracle firsthand. A nation reborn, an ancient language revitalized, a bustling but extremely complicated democracy, and an ancient religious tradition thriving. We supported Israel through federation campaigns and pro-Israel lobbying in D.C. We wanted the next generation to love Israel, sending over 700,000 young Jews for free through the Birthright Foundation to discover their historical roots. But despite our support, Israel is unjustly held to impossibly high standards. No other democracy in the world receives the amount of scrutiny, condemnation, and criticism that Israel faces. The United Nations has passed more resolutions aimed at isolating Israel than resolutions combining warfare, genocide, and human rights violations throughout the rest of the world combined. And here's how to think about this differently. This means that the state of Israel ranks worse in human rights violations than Iran, China, North Korea, Sudan, or Venezuela, where they openly torture, kill, and arrest anyone who doesn't comport to their governments. There's only one reasonable explanation for this: Jew hatred. And perhaps we're thinking, why am I saying Jew hatred and not anti-Semitism? Jew hatred should sting. It should be shock and awe. For too long, academics have been wrestling whether or not that anti-Semitism should be capitalized, or whether or not there should be a hyphen. We don't have time for this. We must call it what it is: Jew hatred. The most famous Torah commentary, Rashi, predicted this 1,000 years ago, writing that when the Jews returned to Israel, the nations would rise up and prevent us from living in our own homeland. Our rabbis understand the high holidays as a 10-day trial. That's why Yom Kippur is also referred to Yom Hadin, the day we stand in judgment. And it's our last day in court before God. Today, on Yom Kippur, I'm offering my court summation to this community. I am not afraid. I want my remarks officially to be on the record about Israel and the Jewish people. As the book of Isaiah instructs us, for the sake of Zion, I will not be silent. For the sake of Jerusalem, I will not be still. But perhaps, let's first talk about the big elephant in the sanctuary and on the webcast. I know we all don't share the same level of support for Israel. Rabbi Grafman's advocacy for Israel caused a major division for this congregation. But he wasn't afraid of the criticism and held firm, because he knew that supporting Israel was not only the morally correct decision, but the only decision, because without the state of Israel, the Jewish people would forever be in turmoil. He was an early Zionist when being a Zionist wasn't a popular road to be on. Rabbi Grafman believed, as do I, in this core rabbinic teaching. Whatever will happen to the Jewish people will happen to Israel, because this is what we are dealing with. Younger American Jews just don't care about Israel in general. They are intentionally disconnecting because of Israel's presence in Judea and Samaria, the lack of religious pluralism, Netanyahu's governance, and the failure for a two-state solution. So many of them bought into the fictional narrative being taught on college and presented in the media. Israel is the only aggressor. Israel is the Goliath. The Palestinians are the only victims. And therefore, this is causing our relationship with Israel to hemorrhage. To stop the bleeding, many rabbis and Jewish leaders currently use this common remedy, which is unfortunately wrong, to remind American Jews that Israel is a young, imperfect democracy. One prime minister doesn't reflect all the country's values. Israelis, just like Americans, often protest their government regarding domestic and international policies, including advocating for Palestinian rights. Israel is full of complexities. It has both economic and social challenges, and neighboring hostile belligerents that are literally right on their borders. So what do we learn from this remedy? Consider giving Israel a chance. She's young and navigates through uncharted waters. Engage with stakeholders and grassroots organizations on the ground that pursue reforms. Above all, try to hold on to that spiritual connection because she is the only Jewish state. I think this approach feels reasonable if we're talking about a new noisy neighbor that just moved in, because it's more complicated than stating the ebb and flow of any Western democracy. Because if the high holidays require us to be honest with ourselves, it's time to have a truthful conversation how we treated Israel and ignored the plight of our own people. We've been obsessively self-critical of Israel for years. Prominent Jewish leaders and nonprofits have been deliberately hostile against Israel, issuing press releases and op-eds that lack nuance, facts, and accusing the IDF, Israel's Defense Forces, of a systematic failure of moral judgment. We're not just turning a blind eye to American elected officials and media outlets who espouse Jew hatred and grotesque anti-Israel positions and coverage, but we rationalize our coalitions and viewership when it fits our domestic agenda, which throws Israel under the bus. We are quick to label Israel as a hotbed of religious orthodoxy, but we've been noticeably quiet regarding China's eradication of Uyghur Muslims, the genocide of Nigeria's Christians, or Iran's Pava, the security police who actively hangs gay people, and the thought of re-entering any form of a nuclear deal with them is simply maddening. The Reform movement issued a resolution against Israel's policies in Judea and Samaria. About Israel, about our own actions, isn't this the Jewish way? The late Jewish author Leonard Fein once wrote, "There's a kind of Jew who detests war and violence, who believes that fighting is not the Jewish way, who willingly accepts that Jews have their own higher standards of behavior, and not just that we have them, but those standards are lifeblood, or what we are about. That's why our Torah, our daily liturgy, and our most prolific the rules of engagement. They roof knock in Gaza to avoid indiscriminate killings, when on the other hand, Hamas concurrently launches thousands of rockets into Israel indiscriminately to kill anything, any life." The morality and ethical code in our tradition is something to celebrate. We cherish life, even when it comes to our enemies. But do we use these values to justify our ongoing obsessive critique about Israel? Do we really think that this is the right path for better press coverage, the cessation of UN resolutions and boycotts? Will our overly self-critical mindset alleviate anti-Jewish hostility our children face on the college campus? It appears that the Jewish community holds Israel to a higher standard than we judge ourselves, our children, and our parents. So in essence, we don't hold Israel to an impossibly high standard. We hold Israel to an impossible standard. The path we're on won't inspire young American Jews, and it certainly won't stop the bleeding. The more we single out Israel, the more we hold Israel to unfair and impossible moral standards that no other country in the world faces, we are destroying our right to self-determination and eventually rejecting the miracle in 1948. And even with the warning signs, the rise of the BDS movement, the sharp increase of Jew hatred and violence against Jews on campus and the streets of Europe, the blatant blood libels from prominent news organizations. These two in particular, the murders of Sarah Halimi and Joseph Newman. For those who aren't familiar with Sarah Halimi, she was murdered in Paris for being a Jew. The terrorist that killed her shouted Allahu Akbar many times and then threw her out of a window. The French courts believed that since he was high on marijuana, he could not do any jail time. But consider another situation where someone on cocaine threw a dog out the window and faced 2 years in prison. Joseph Newman, on the other hand, was murdered in Muncie, New York 2 years ago, butchered to death. His attacker will not be held to justice as well. There have been countless attacks against the Hasidic community in New York, which our movement has been utterly too silent. There have been condemnations and investigations from the UN, EU, and the ICC. So we haven't changed as an American Jewish community. We've ignored the signs. We've ignored our people. And then this past May happened. Mahmoud Abbas, who was serving his 16th year of his first term in office of the PLO, canceled the elections because he was polling poorly against Hamas. He took advantage of an ongoing housing dispute in Jerusalem. He provoked young Arabs, instructing them to attack Jews in Jerusalem, put them on social media, and they called this the TikTok Intifada, and then incited Arabs to arm the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. He got his headlines. Israelis were evicting Arabs and storming the Al-Aqsa Mosque. But Hamas wouldn't let Abbas get the upper hand. In 9 days, they launched 3,500 indiscriminate rockets into Israel, which caused Israel to respond. But in May, it was different this time. The media not only continued their blood libel against Israel's justified response, but they also mainstreamed Jewish hate by giving airtime to Omar Barghouti, the founder of the BDS movement, and other guests who were blatantly hostile to Israel. Universities and nonprofits issued solidarity statements with the Palestinian people and accused Israel of colonialism, white supremacy, and genocide. The chancellor of Rutgers University, Christopher Malloy, first issued a statement condemning Jewish hate, then apologized for the statement because of the pressure mounting from pro-Palestinian student groups. Pro-Palestinian activists vandalized synagogues and physically assaulted Jews in Los Angeles, New York, and known Jewish areas in America and in Europe. The chants were "Death to Jews" and "Free Palestine." At the end of the spring, Jew hatred increased 500% in the US and in England. And pro-Palestinian activism right here in our city, where hundreds gathered downtown screaming from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. I spoke about this at length in May and June. Many of us were scared and horrified with the rise of Jew hatred. But the pain didn't stop. We experienced silence from our interfaith partners and allies. We were victims again, screaming for help in Beverly Hills, Times Square, Florida, London, and Paris. But the world saw us as the oppressor. Jewish Birmingham rallied together, showing some promising signs of Israel advocacy, but the same old dilemmas appeared. Young Jews weren't in the pews and at the rallies, nor were they interested in joining our newly formed Israel Action Committee. The influence of the 24-hour news cycle lured us away from the plight of our people. The summer arrived. We went to the lake. We went to the beach. And when I spoke about ongoing issues about Israel, Jewish hate, the threat from Iran, congregants asked me to respect the sanctity of Shabbat. So this is precisely why I'm going on the record. I'm a Jew. I'm a Zionist. I'm committed to every Jew, period. Here on Highland Avenue, on Overton Road, regardless of movement. Without a safe and secure Israel, without the celebration of the miracle in 1948, Judaism and the Jewish people will greatly suffer. I'm going on the record because I won't allow this to happen. In our high holiday liturgy, we publicly confess that we've easily forgotten Zion. It's not only our time to remember, but time to change the current course. So many of you ask me, what's the plan moving forward? We must commit to sending our teens and young adults to Israel annually. We must encourage gap years in Israel and strong attendance in Jewish summer camp. Evidence-based studies tell us that travel to Israel and summer camp significantly strengthens Jewish identity. And I want to talk to every parent right now who has kids in sports. I love playing sports. I was a 4-year letterman in college. More than likely, we're not going to go pro. Take that time away from all those activities and sports. Send them to Jewish summer camp. Send them to Israel. This is what evidence tells us. And I promise you, scoring that goal will feel good. But seeing the history of our people in the foothills of Judea and Samaria where the Maccabees fought will have a lasting memory. We also need to stop being obsessively critical about Israel and holding Israel to a double standard that no other country in the world faces. I promise you that Israel isn't perfect and will continue to make mistakes, but like every Western democracy, I have no doubt there'll be future coalitions we absolutely hate. But holding Israel to this impossible standard only undermines it and threatens Jews worldwide. And here's a hard one. It's time to hold our partners and allies accountable. If they delegitimize, demonize, and subject Israel to double standards, and have allyship or partnerships with known Jew haters and anti-Israel activists. And this is going to require us from looking at their funders, seeing who else they partner with or intersection with. I know this is going to be hard because we care about issues in this country. We spent years building relationships with nonprofits and faith groups that help support many common causes. I certainly empathize. I know that there's so many members of this congregation who are active in domestic matters, which is a celebration of the democratic process. The lesson moving forward is, don't ever give up the fight for justice. But we need to build coalitions with organizations that support us too. People who will show up for us the same way that we show up for them, where we don't need to call on them first, and where I don't have to stand here and speak to our congregation when our interfaith partners have been silent. We also can't underestimate the significance of grassroots advocacy. Lobbying local government is a powerful method to effect change. Our friend Ed Fields, the chief strategist in the mayor's office, spoke at the JCRC's rally against Jew hate here at Temple Emanu-El in late June. I publicly asked Ed for the city of Birmingham to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism, which would send a major statement for the city of Birmingham for its support for the Jewish people and Israel. I followed up a week later. He texted back, could we kindly hold off until after the election? I agreed. Mayor Woodfin was just elected to his second term. It's time for all of us to call the mayor and get this done. If a media outlet or publication is erroneously hostile to Israel, where its reporting is full of lies which in effect causes any harm to the Jewish people as demonstrated this past spring, turn the channel and cancel our subscriptions. This may be controversial, but we need to ask it. Here's a question the American Jewish community needs to answer. Can any publication be called a paper of record when its history includes burying the Holocaust, actively lying about Israel, and is openly aggressive to Jewish employees that has caused resignations? Synagogues must make Israel education a top priority for our children and adults. And I'm so proud that Linda Gutchin in our Southgate program has engaged the iCenter in Chicago for them to learn about Israel. And in our incredible community Kesher program, our teens will learn how to respond to false accusations against Israel. And here's an example. When Israel is called an apartheid state, our students, our adults, need to know how to respond. Israel is not an apartheid state because the overwhelming majority of our citizens are Jews. Arab Israelis are minorities with full legal rights who are employed in any sector, high sectors, and positions in Israel. I also want to say this. Let's look at the facts regarding the word Palestine. The Greek historian Herodotus used the Greek word for Palestine to refer to Judea in the 5th century BCE. And it was the Romans who renamed Judea to Syria Palestinia as punishment because of the rebellion in 135 CE. This is a fact. Jews are indigenous to Judea. Arabs are indigenous to Arabia. Historical Palestine is the history of the Jewish people in Judea. And finally, I've had many students participate in the March of Living, a program that brings Jewish teens to Poland to learn about the Holocaust. They walk around Auschwitz draped in an Israeli flag, and I wasn't a fan of this image because the creation of the state of Israel did not happen because of the Holocaust. This was hard work, a movement that started in the late 19th century. But sometimes we need to be open-minded. So I learned to love this message because it reinforces our new story. We are here to stay. We are not going anywhere. We will defend our people. We are not victims anymore. This is because of Israel, the greatest miracle for the Jewish people. And this must be our mindset moving forward, because I don't want our people to suffer, to be in exile and wander. I don't want our people to be oppressed. We must be in control of our own fate. As much as Rashi may have correctly predicted that the nations wouldn't allow Jews to have sovereignty in our homeland, but I won't allow them to succeed, and we can't allow it. That's why I'm not afraid to say all this, and that's why I am on the record, and this is why we must be on the record too. So this is the new year where we love Israel unconditionally. support her loudly and proudly, and stop holding her to any impossible standard. This is our plan because we must do this for every college student who is assaulted for being Jewish. We must do this for every Jew in any synagogue and on any street. We must do this to find some justice for Sarah Halimi and Joseph Newman and any Jew throughout our history that was murdered for being Jewish. We must do this for the next generation. As Rabbi Sonnenfeld said, have you ever heard of a mother say she has no place for her children? Eretz Yisrael, our mother, will always find a place for her children. And we will always hold Israel as a sacred and indigenous homeland of every single Jew, because Israel is everything. I repeat, Israel is everything to us, to the Jewish people, and to Judaism. This is my summation, and I rest my case.